All right, we're in the home stretch, and we're going to talk now about developing a sample plan. And this will conclude our lecture series 6. And again, we're going to talk about error in lecture series 7. So we'll be dovetailing with some of the topics we've talked about here. So there are really 6 different steps that are involved in creating a sample plan. And a sample plan is where you write down in your proposal or in your research planning document or whatever you're using to decide how you're going to do your research, what steps you're actually going to take in order to sample a population. So first of all, the first step, of course, is to define the population. Who's going to be included in the study, and do we need a sample or a census? Now, most of the time, like I've said, it's going to be a sample. You're not going to take a census unless you can afford to or unless you really need to. Next, you're going to obtain your sample frame. So once you've defined your population, you need to get a list of the people that are going to be in your population, and you need to decide where you're going to get that list from. Then you can decide on your sample method, which you're going to think about probability or non-probability, and which of those methods that I shared with you, simple random, interval, stratified, cluster for probability, convenience, purposive, referral, or quota from the non-probability, which of those are you going to use? Then you want to decide on your sample size. In a probability sample, you're going to think about the margin of error that you're willing to accept. In a non-probability sample, you're just going to think about what size of the sample you need for data sufficiency in order to feel really good about your results. Then you'll go out and actually draw your sample, conduct the field work, and then you'll validate your sample, which is where you're measuring what you got in your actual sample versus the population statistics that were known prior to conducting the study. So did you, for example, set out to get 50% men and 50% women, and you got 70% women and 30% men? If so, you may need to go out and conduct some additional field work to bring things in line. So validating the sample is an important step. Unfortunately, it doesn't get done nearly enough, but it is important. And what you can do on the back end, if you don't want to go back out and fill in your sample with more field work, is you can go through a process called weighting, where you can say, okay, well, we got 70% women and 30% men, but I'm going to adjust the data a little bit so that men get a higher voice and women get less of a voice, and then it evens out. It's an appropriate way to deal with things. It's not as good as going out and getting actual data, but it is one way that you can deal with validating the sample to make sure that it matches the population statistics more precisely. So when you're thinking about sample size is something that's really, really difficult to decide on. It can keep you up at night thinking about, are you sampling enough people, or are you sampling too many people? Because in a research project, sample size is often directly related to cost. So there's 3 things that we really have to think about. One is the margin of error, the second is the confidence level, and the third is variability. Now, I'm going to explain what these are, and then I'm going to give you an example. I think the example makes a lot more sense than the explanations, but I think they're all intuitive when you think about them. Okay, so margin of error is the amount of sample error that we want in our findings. Now, we don't want any sample error in our findings, I'm going to say that, but we have to be willing to accept that we're going to have some. So normally, we can get by with about 3 to 5%. Normally, it depends on the study, but we have to really ask ourselves what's the purpose of our study. Because if we're looking, for example, for long-term trends, if we're going to be comparing data from quarter to quarter or year to year, we need a lower margin of error, or else we're not going to really be able to see those changes, because the error is going to make those changes harder to spot. So error can be a good thing, it can be a bad thing, or it can never be a good thing other than just making the study cheaper, but it can be a very bad thing if the purpose of your study is to look for changes or to look for really fine differences between variables or things like that. The confidence level is the probability that we're willing to accept that our findings will be repeatable. So again, if we repeat the study the same way, using the same random selection process with the same sample frame, will we get the same results? That's what the confidence level tells us. And that's going to be expressed in terms of a percentage. So often we'll say this has a 95% confidence level, which means that 95 times out of 100 or 19 times out of 20, when we repeat the study, we're going to get the same results. But 1 time out of 20, we're not going to get the same results, and that's what we need to be concerned about. Is that 1 time out of 20? Are we willing to take that risk? Variability is what likelihood there is that two respondents, when asked the same question, will provide a different answer. This one is the hardest of the three concepts to understand. So what we often do in the field of marketing research is say, you know what, just assume maximum variability, and we express this in a percentage. We'll say, assume that, if I call heads, the other person's going to call tails. So 50% of the time I'm going to be right, and 50% of the time you're going to be right. So we'll call that a 50-50 split. That's what our variability would be, 50%. And that's generally what we recommend, is just stick with what maximum variability is, a 50-50 split. So we say variability is 50%. Don't worry too much about variability. Let me explain this example, and I think it'll help you to understand the concept. So let's say that there's a guy who's a lot like me. His name is Adam, and Adam, like me, commutes to work every day. Now my commute takes about 45 minutes, so does Adam's. So Adam and I have a lot in common. So Adam is driving to work every day, and on average, his commute takes about 45 minutes. But it never takes exactly 45 minutes, okay? Every day, there's something that makes his trip take a little bit more or a little bit less time. It could be that he gets all the green lights on his way and is able to get to work, in 42 minutes. Or it could be that he hits every red light and he gets to work in 48 minutes. So it's not a lot of variation, but there's some variation. So generally speaking, Adam can expect it takes between 42 and 48 minutes to get to work, which means that if he's ever got to be in a meeting or something like that that's going to be in his office, he better plan for the longer average than for the shorter part of the range. And he might say it takes me on average 48 or 45 minutes, but it can take me as many as 48 or as few as 42 on a typical day. But not every day is typical. One of the things that is on Adam's path is that there's a train track, and sometimes he has to stop and wait for a train to go by. Also, there's every now and then there's construction going on, and construction causes a bottleneck, and that slows everything down. So there are times where Adam's trip can take a lot longer. It could take maybe 50, 60 minutes to get to work. He could hit traffic, things like that. Other times, every now and then he just gets exceedingly lucky, and there's just hardly anybody on the road, and he decides that he's going to speed, not worry too much about police, and he's able to get to work in like 35 minutes, because he's just booking along. So, he's got there is some variation to what his trip is, but on average it's 45 minutes. So the margin of error is typically going to be expressed as the typical range in minutes required for him to get to the office. So if we say his average is 45 minutes plus or minus 3 minutes, then in a typical day he can expect to make it to his office between 42 and 48 minutes, barring all those other circumstances I talked about. The confidence level of Adam's trip is how consistently a day's travel time matches Adam's normal commute. So if on his first day to work it takes him an hour to get to work, he doesn't know yet whether or not that's representative or not of what his normal experience is going to be. So if his confidence level is very, very high, then he'll say, oh man, it's going to take me an hour to get to work every day. Gosh, it's going to be horrible. Well, he might find out later on that was not his normal experience, that it really only takes him 45 minutes. He just had a bad day that day. Also, it may be that those extenuating circumstances that I talk about happen a lot more often than not, and so his confidence level that it's only going to take 45 minutes might be a little bit lower because of those extenuating circumstances. The variability, I'm going to introduce a second person here named Eve. So let's say that every part of what makes Adam get to work in the time that he does is that every now and then he's going to hit a red light where it's going to be starting to turn yellow before he's actually gotten into the intersection. And he has to make a decision whether he's going to stop or whether he's going to go and risk running a red light. And Adam decides every single time, because he's in a hurry, he hates his commute, that he's going to go. He's going to always make that choice to go through the intersection and risk running a red light. Eve, on the other hand, is a little bit more timid than Adam. And when Eve sees a yellow light, she automatically starts slowing down and brakes so that she stops before the light turns red. And so she's always going to be a little bit slower than Adam. So what we would say is that the variability between these two people is at a high level. And that if Adam, for whatever reason, decides to stop at the red light, and Eve decides to go through the red light, that's just due to randomness. That's not due to the normal way that they would do things. So what we would say is that the variability between the way that these two people would do things is at a 50-50 split. Adam tends to go, Eve tends to stop. So therefore, they have a high amount of variability in the way that they perceive the same situation. So those are the three things you need to think about. Now, the reason you need to think about those is because those three components are used to calculate sample size. And I put here two charts. One with a confidence level of 95% and a variability of 50%. Like I said, 50%, 50-50 split. And then one with a confidence level of 99% and a variability of 50%. And on the far left in both charts, you can see the error level. And the error level is expressed in a plus or minus. So at plus or minus 10% in a normal sized population, you'd only need to conduct 97 interviews to have a confidence level of 90% and a variability of 50%. So you don't have, this could be a population of American citizens, okay? 330 million Americans. You only need to talk to 97 of them to have a margin of error of plus or minus 10%. Now that's not real good data, but it also means you don't have to interview 330 million people. You only have to interview 100 of them. Not so bad. As you can see, I recommended the range for being between 3 and 5% margin of error. So we're really only talking about between 400 to about 1,100 people at a survey to achieve those margins of error in a general population study. Now, if you want to increase that confidence level so you can make sure that your results are almost always going to be repeated, no matter what, then you can see that the numbers do go up. For example, plus or minus 5%. I need 385 people at the 95% confidence level, but at 99% confidence level, I need 664, which basically means that I need almost double the amount of people I needed for that plus or minus 5% at 95%. So the 99% confidence level can mean that you need a lot more interviews. As you can see, if I want to really get down to a high level of accuracy, if I want a margin of error of 1%, I need to interview almost 10,000 people for my 95% confidence level, or almost 16.5 thousand people for a 99% confidence level. And if I want to go even lower than that, I can get up into the hundreds of thousands or millions of people that I need to interview in order to get to that really, really high level of accuracy. So again, high level of accuracy means you have to increase the sample size quite a lot. And you're never going to be able to get perfect accuracy unless you conduct a census. But at least the good news is most of the time interviewing hundreds or maybe thousands of people is quite sufficient and doesn't mean that you need to interview millions of people to get the data that you're looking for. So in selecting a sample size for your sample plan, just keep in mind the larger your sample size, the lower your margin of error and the higher your confidence level. So variability might turn out when you're done with your study to be lower than expected when you're looking at your findings, but it's always best to assume a variability of 50-50, that respondents are always going to differ in what they say. That ensures that you don't undersample. Now, if you have historical data to go on and you're relatively certain about your variability, you can lower that threshold if you want to, but I wouldn't recommend it unless you really know what you're doing. If you become a professional marketing researcher, that's a consideration that you really need to weigh carefully to make sure that you don't undersample, because undersampling means that your data might not be real great. Now, if you want to actually play around with the sample size calculator that I used to generate all the numbers on this previous slide, by the way, you can see a sample size for a given situation might be by clicking on the link on this slide. And of course, these will be up on Blackboard and in the public folder in Dropbox. Now, in concluding, in talking about our conclusions about what we have to say here, let me pull up my notes here. Hold on just a second. One of the things that I want to make really clear is that we're always interested in having data that are projectable if possible. We're always interested in having data that we can use over time if possible. They're much more useful to us that way than if they're just describing a sample at a time. But again, it depends on the context, it depends on the circumstance. So you have to remember that if you're going to do a probability-based study, it tends to be more expensive, it tends to be more time-consuming, it tends to be just a lot more trouble. So the trade-off that you get for doing a non-probability study is that it's easier, it's cheaper, and it can be quicker. So it's really about thinking at the end of the day, what kind of information do I really need? What am I going to do with this information? And how can I ensure that this information is going to be good enough for what I'm looking for without costing me so much that it's not worth the trouble? It's always better to have the best possible data. I mean, for that matter, it's always better to have open-ended questions than scaled questions or closed-ended categorical questions if you really know what to do with all that open-ended data. But the time commitment involved, the amount of interpretation involved, all the problems that come with that open-ended data can really prevent you from being able to do anything useful with it. So we have to make compromises and ask questions in different ways. Well, likewise, you have to sample in different ways and make compromises based on what your needs are. And all that means is that you just have to think really hard about what is it I really want to get out of this study? Do I want something where I can just get some ideas, I can just get a read on things, or do I want something where I can really, truly understand what a population thinks? And that's where you ultimately make your decision. Well, now that we've covered all of that, in our next lecture series, we're going to talk about error in a lot more detail. We're going to talk about sampling error, we're going to talk about non-sampling error, and we're going to discuss how both can impact the quality of data dramatically if the research team doesn't plan ahead. We're also going to talk about some survey taking patterns that can really be difficult, like straight lining, yay saying, nay saying, middle of the roading, things like that, where respondents can really mess up your data set by answering questions improperly. So we'll see you then.